cloud, and we'll start. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight and we are thrilled tonight to host tonight's event with Maureen Mahon presenting her new book, Black Diamond Queens, African-American Women and Rock and Roll. She's gonna be talking with Bridgett M. Davis, so you are in for an excellent time tonight. Before we start, I just wanna say a huge thanks to Maureen, Bridgett, and the team at Duke University Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store locations right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversations like this. So just a couple housekeeping things first. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat throughout the event. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. Tell us where you're watching from. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And very importantly, tonight's featured book, Black Diamond Queens, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in our bookstore locations 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Maureen's book and many others on site, or purchase on our website for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat in a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. So some introductions. Our interviewer tonight is Bridgett M. Davis. She's the author of two novels, Into the Go Slow and Shifting Through Neutral, as well as the memoir, The World According to Fannie Davis, My Mother's Life in the Detroit Numbers, which was on every best of and notable list you can possibly think of, and which she presented at Greenlight Bookstore in person in February 2019. She's currently writing the screenplay for the film adaptation of that book. Davis is a creative writing and journalism professor at City University of New York's Baruch College. She's going to be speaking tonight with our featured author, Maureen Mahon. She's associate professor of music at New York University and the author previously of Right to Rock, the Black Rock Coalition and the Cultural Politics of Race, also published by Duke University Press. Her new book, Black Diamond Queens, draws on recordings, press coverage, archival materials, and interviews to document the history of African-American women in rock and roll between the 1950s and the 1980s. By uncovering this hidden history of Black women in rock and roll, Mahon reveals a powerful sonic legacy that continues to reverberate into the 21st century. So we're really looking forward to hearing more. Maureen's going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Bridgett and with all of you. Please take it away, Maureen.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And I just want to thank you and everyone at Greenlight for hosting this event, for welcoming me to your webinar. I'm really happy to be able to be here and to share the book with you. And also, of course, thank you to my conversation partner, Bridgett, for joining in. So I'm going to read just from the very first pages of the book, be about 5 minutes, to give a little bit of a sense of what some of the issues are that I'm trying to address in the book. Santi White threw down the gauntlet shortly after the 2008 release of her first full-length recording under her moniker Santa Gold. Some music critics were labeling her as an R&B singer, and she was outraged with what she viewed as inaccurate classification of her music. "It's racist," the singer and songwriter told a reporter. Quote, "It's totally racist. Everyone is just so shocked that I don't like R&B. Why does R&B keep coming into my interviews? It's pissing me off. I didn't grow up as a big fan of R&B and like, what is the big shocker? It's stupid. In the beginning, I thought that was funny. I'm an MC, I'm a soul singer, I'm a dance hybrid artist," end quote. The songs on Santa Gold feature sly and catchy meldings of ska, reggae, and rock rhythms. There are dub echoes and danceable synthesizer effects, all with White's laid-back, talk-singing vocals riding over the top. White and her producers had created musical settings that drew on everything from 80s new wave to Jamaican dance hall to electronica, but it was a stretch to hear the album as contemporary R&B. White, an African-American woman, argued that commentators assigned her to the genre because of her race while ignoring her actual sound, and she was not happy about it. Placing Santigold into one of the music genre categories set aside for African-American musicians did not make musical sense, but it was part of a long tradition of prioritizing racial identity over musical sound when marketing pop music. Genre categories simplify things for music business professionals, whether at record labels, music venues, or media outlets. They help identify an artist's potential audience and determine how to promote their music. As such, genre labels have a powerful effect on the shape and direction of an artist's career. Concerned with what she viewed as the misrepresentation of her creative work, White resisted the flawed categorization, pointing out that she was being grouped into a style of music for which she had no affinity and to which her genre-blending music was only tenuously connected. Santi White is not the first African-American woman to struggle with issues of music genre and professional career. In fact, she is one in a long line of artistically adventurous African-American women whose sounds have shaped the musical and cultural terrain, but whose race and gender identities have made their impact difficult to hear and acknowledge. This has been especially true for women participating in the unruly genre of rock and roll. Since the 1950s, when they were among the rhythm and blues artists who created the music that took the name rock and roll, African-American women have made pivotal contributions to the form as it underwent decades of stylistic and cultural changes. Stories of their involvement in rock and roll, however, have been marginal to the dominant narrative, and, like Santi White, they have been pressed into genres deemed appropriate for African-American women, or not talked about at all. Black Diamond Queens, African-American Women in Rock and Roll, discusses the careers of a cross-section of Black women vocalists, revealing the simultaneous conditions of audibility and inaudibility, of presence and absence that characterize their careers in order to amplify their musical, creative, and critical voices. It may seem unusual to foreground Black women in a discussion of a genre associated with white youth rebellion, the formation of male identities, and a fair amount of misogyny. Unlike the blues, jazz, or soul, rock and roll is a counterintuitive place to look for African-American women. It is precisely this apparent disconnect that compels me. Ideas about what rock and roll music is and who is qualified to perform it, in short, the everyday workings of genre classification, have marginalized African-American women in discussions of the history of the genre. This is troubling since Black women have influenced the sound, feel, and image of the music from its beginnings. Still, their involvement is often overlooked as assumptions about music genre and social identity combine to create a narrative that is mostly male and predominantly white. In most mainstream histories of rock and roll, Black women are mentioned only briefly, if at all, and the particularities of their music and experiences are rarely considered. Black Diamond Queens moves Black women to the center of the discussion and listens to the voices of African-American women in rock and roll from 1953, when blues singer Big Mama Thornton topped the R&B charts with her hit Hound Dog, to 1984, when the solo career of veteran performer Tina Turner took flight and she won recognition as the queen of rock and roll. I examine the race, gender, and genre challenges that Thornton, Turner, and a host of others encountered, and explore the interracial and cross-gender collaborations in which they engaged in order to uncover a hidden history of African-American women in rock and roll.
Thank you so much, Maureen. That's really such a powerful way to introduce your book. I love that you start with Santa Gold because it really captures, seems like it captures the essence of what your book is really helping us to understand. I mean, it feels like it's all really ultimately about this tyranny of not just race and gender, but genre, right?
Right.
And I just loved how you presented what I felt was like this radical idea because I hadn't thought of it in this way before. You say that when we step outside of these genres, that we actually hear the music differently, right? And so as listeners, right,
Right.
it's the difference between the sonic qualities and what you call this social identity. So could you just talk about that a bit, how we just moving away from the genre will actually hear the same music differently?
Mhm. Yeah, this was really a big piece of it for me to sort of try to find a way to talk about music genre. And then I realized that genre is this, it's a very important tool, but it's a very restrictive tool. And it leads us to make certain assumptions and certain associations. And I was trying to find a way to talk about people that I knew were there. I knew the names of people. I didn't know that much about them, but I knew they were there. And I was trying to understand why did they disappear from the story. And so by talking about what the music sounded like and how the music sounded at certain points in the history, I was able to sort of recover the presence of these women in a way that's harder to do if you're sticking to just an idea about what rock and roll is that's really rooted in an idea of the sound of rock and roll at the end of the 1960s, or a sound that was prominent in the middle of the 1970s. By going outside of those boundaries, I was able to hear the presence of African American women, but especially going back to the 1950s, but the other piece of it was in the 1950s, those African American women were thought of as rock and roll. So another part of the story and another part of the project was to try to talk about how the genre categories shift and displace people and sort of alter the way we understand the history. And then, as you were saying, also the way we hear the music. So it's harder in some ways to associate the sounds of a Ruth Brown or LaVern Baker or Etta James with rock and roll, because we have this particular, a different sonic idea of what rock and roll is. So it was working with like both within and against genre to try to get at a way to recover these women.
Yeah, I was reading your book and I kept thinking about Sadia Hartman.
Mm,
I feel like, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiment,
yeah.
conversation with your book. And it made me wonder, I thought, wow, yeah, this is another example of Black women who were absolutely limited in what they could do. And at the same time, they lived pretty adventurous lives compared to other Black women.
Right.
Yeah, it's like that dichotomy. And it was exciting to see that. And I thought, as a scholar, how do you, really approach this reclamation process? Like, what's that mean for you?
Mm-hmm.
Even how you uh, interrogate the archives. Like, I just am so fascinated by that. Yeah.
So that's such a wonderful connection. When I read Sadia Hartman's book, I felt the sort of feeling of jubilation that she had found these women. And what she talks about having to search for people who were really intentionally being left out. They were never supposed to be in the archive. And my situation was a little bit different because I actually was able to find a lot of material about these women in the archive. So what was interesting to me was the fact that that archive hadn't really been consulted. Nothing that I found was a mysterious text that was tucked away in the back of a library that someone remembered might be there, and we opened it up and made this incredible discovery. I was just going through old issues of music press like Billboard, Variety. I did a lot of work with Rolling Stone and a lot of work with the British music press because they actually covered African American musicians much more thoroughly and much more expansively than the American rock press did. There's some material in the Black press in the 1950s, a lot of excitement about LaVern Baker in the 1950s, but there was also a little bit of respectability politics at work in the Black press, and this music, it's still a little bit you know, rhythm and blues, still a little bit disreputable, and they weren't always comfortable spotlighting these artists. When they got really popular, then and especially if they crossed over, if they were super successful, then there were stories about them. And that's how I was able to learn about the Shirelles, a girl group from the 1960s. So for me, it was a process of going back through the archive that all of us who are doing research on popular music are consulting, those sort of, you know, standard music magazines and industry newspapers, and just kind of combing through to find these Black women who had slipped through the cracks. And then the other piece of it was going through the biographies of the white artists who they crossed paths with, and hoping that I would find, you know, a mention of, you know, did they talk about meeting up with or having some kind of, you know, encounter with Big Mama Thornton or Tina Turner or one of the background vocalists that I talk about from the, you know, later part of the 1960s. So it was also looking at other people's histories, other artists who have been more covered and more researched, and try to find the presence of these women there.
I mean, it's a real excavation project, right?
Yes.
You have this moment that for some reason really touched me when you are describing your process of tracking down this album that this woman has recorded, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you tell the story, and it takes you across the pond.
Right.
There you are in the listening room. Yeah.
So one of the things, you know, in trying to find these different women, I learned, and I think it's significant the way I learned about Marcia Hunt, who was an African-American woman born in Philadelphia, raised on the West Coast in Berkeley, California. I learned about her because of her association with Mick Jagger. So she was one of the women who was known to have dated Mick Jagger. And she was, interestingly, she is the mother of his first child. So his oldest daughter, Karis, is Marcia Hunt's only child. So I learned this about her. And so that made me very curious. And it turns out that she wrote a memoir. So I found the memoir somehow, and the memoir was published in England. She had moved to England and she stayed there, and she really made her career there. So she's not well known in the United States, but she's pretty well known in England, and she had a really eclectic career. She started out singing, she moved to England in 1966, so around the same time that Jimi Hendrix moved to England. And she started out singing in these blues, white British blues bands. They were excited to have her because they were like, oh, you're an authentic Black American, you must be able to sing. And she always admitted that she wasn't a good singer, but she had a lot of performance chops. And so she could put a song over. She goes from that to going into the theater. She is in the London premiere of Hair. And that brings her a lot of attention. She ends up being photographed by some of the top photographers in England at the time. And so she shows up in Vogue. So she's one of the first Black women to be featured in Vogue magazine, both in the UK and also in the United States. And then she gets a record contract, and she's signed to the same label as Jimi Hendrix and The Who. And there's a lot of back and forth between her and the label and trying to get the album put together. And it finally comes out. At one point, she was working with Tony Visconti, who's best known for his work with Mark Bolan and then David Bowie. But he's not able to stay on the project because of a lot of record label politics. But the upshot is she finally gets this record released. It's not a record that I was able to find in the US. So I had other things that I was looking for. I really wanted to spend time looking at British music newspapers and archive at the British Library. So I did that. And one of the things that they had was this Marcia Hunt album that was called Woman Child. And so you can't record, you can only listen. And I just sat and it was a really interesting experience because it is kind of like a performance art piece. I mean, she's an actress, she's a theater person. And that was one of the tensions in her career, was that the guys at Track Records didn't feel like she was an authentic enough rocker. and she also doesn't have the sort of gospel inflected vocal chops that people were listening for from Black women. She doesn't sing in that style. So she's doing something very different. And it was just so interesting to hear this playfulness and experimentation and some very odd choices and things like I wondered, why did they do that? But just to hear an African-American woman like doing that kind of creative experimentation with music was really a pleasure. And that was her, that came out in the early 1970s. And then she continued, ended up as an interviewer at Capitol Radio, and became really known as a very like smart, someone who could really do a good interview with people. So she's just had this really interesting career, but it's a kind of story that I feel like we should know about Black women. We should know that women did this kind of thing, this kind of self-invention. And so it was a story that I was really happy to tell in the book.
Yeah, I was just astonished that I had never heard of her, and yet she had this incredible life. I mean, and I felt that throughout with many of the profiles that you chose, of these women. I was just thinking that I want to step back and just say that there's this lovely moment where you provide a bit of a personal narrative.
Mm.
And it's lovely to see that coming from someone who's doing obviously very complex and rich cultural work in the book. And it's so beautifully researched, so scholarly. And yet here was this personal narrative that really allowed us to see you come of age, through the music you were listening to, which I thought, I've never seen that from a Black woman before. I've just never seen that kind of narrative. And I thought it was really helpful. I mean, I understand that you probably felt a bit like a unicorn growing up, but it was great. I mean, when you mentioned Joan Armatrading, for instance, it brought all these memories back to me of how exciting it was to have this Black woman out there singing that kind of music and being into her, right?
Right.
But you did listen to a lot of British rock bands, Maureen.
Oh yeah, that was my thing. I remember when my sisters came down for my high school graduation because they lived in New York at the time that I graduated. And I grew up in Virginia. And my older sister, Diane, was looking through my record collection and she said, "You got a lot of David Bowie records." And I was like, yeah. But that's what was really interesting to me. It was a different sound. And I grew up near DC, so I could hear the Washington, DC radio stations. So I listened to both the classic rock, well, no, it wasn't called classic rock then, it was just, that was rock then. Right. So I would listen to those stations. Sometimes I would listen to the Black stations. And when I was in middle school, I listened to the top 40 stations. So I was listening to a little bit of everything. But the thing I really connected with was stuff that seemed a little bit off center, a little bit strange. I was very excited when Prince arrived on the scene because the first couple of albums, he seemed like just other R&B singers. But then when he came out with Dirty Mind and Controversy, that was like, oh, right. That's in the record collection too. Exactly. So I put that narrative in, one, because I wanted people to sort of understand where I was coming from as a music listener. And I talk about a lot of British rock artists in my book, but it's also because there really were a lot of collaborations and connections between British rock artists and African-American women. Dusty Springfield, so a white British woman, was one of the first to make these connections. And so I wanted to highlight that. But for me, it was, I thought it was sort of funny that there was this, I felt, strong connection to British rock, and then to find that British rockers had this strong connection to African-American women over the years. And it was just some kind of thing that happened. So I figured it would be another story worth telling.
I was going to say that you have this great line where you say at the time you realized you were listening to this music that had the absence of Black people, but it had the presence of Blackness. That's a great line, by the way. And also it's like you understood something before you even knew that, say, these Black women were backup singers for these
Right.
British rockers, or that they were being influenced. But you were still being attracted to the music beyond your understanding of why, really.
Right.
Yeah, which is kind of moving, actually. Yeah. So I really want to talk about some of the biographies that are in the
Mhm.
book. That's really also just so it's just so unique again, because some of these women we've sort of heard of.
Right.
Big Mama Thornton, we feel like we know Tina Turner,
Mhm.
actually apparently not really, because of the the sort of trail that you provide of her. I feel like I learned about her anew, you know. But then there were women, I mean, Evelyn Baker, I'd never heard her.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I have this question, I mean, how did you decide which
Yes.
profile? I mean, I just thought, whoa, that must have been a big challenge, or you had to really come up with some kind of organizing principle, right?
Yeah, and it was a very arbitrary principle, and I think that's probably true of a lot of writing that gets done, and a lot of research is sort of what you can find about people. Um, but you know, the other thing for me was to try to talk about people who hadn't been talked about that much before. And Tina Turner is the one exception, because it wouldn't be possible for me to write about African American women in rock and roll and not talk about Tina Turner. Um, but I wanted to look at her work with Ike and then what came after in a slightly different way. And these are things that she talks about in her autobiography, but maybe aren't as commonly known or recognized. But for the rest of the women, there really wasn't that much information about them. Um, and so that helped me decide some people to leave out who could very, well fit into the book, because I didn't include a whole chapter on Etta James or Ruth Brown or Ronnie Spector, because they had written, or Darlene Love, because they had all written autobiographies that circulated pretty well. And so their story is out there. I wanted to talk about LaVern Baker specifically because so many people don't know about her. And she was very adamant that she did not want to write an autobiography. She did not want her business out in the street. She wasn't going to do that. So she kind of disappears, I think also because she didn't put her story out, and didn't get that sort of attention and visibility that those memoirs gave to their writers. So that was, that was some of the choice. The other was, for example, I decided to write about the Shirelles, a girl group from the 60s. There's so many girl groups from the 60s, but the Shirelles were the first successful girl group. And when I say successful, I mean they had a #1 pop hit. So that was the measure of success. And when I went to look for information about them, there was just, there wasn't really a whole lot. And there's some stories about them, but the way girl groups were marketed, the focus was on the group, and the real focus was on the producers and the songwriters. And so the individuality of the women in the group was really not an emphasis. And I was fortunate to be able to talk with Beverly Lee, who was one of the Shirelles, and have her tell me a little bit of her story. And in all of these, I'm not talking about personal relationships and all of that stuff. The focus is really on the professional career and the music and what their experiences were dealing with the industry. And I think, the other thing with stories of African-American women in music is a lot of the time, the emphasis is on the personal. And the music, the artistry can fall by the wayside. So I really wanted to highlight the music and their contributions to rock and roll, but also to American popular music generally.
I mean, it's no surprise that so many Black women are like left in obscurity, right? And so as you know, I care a lot about bringing those women's lives to the fore.
Right.
And I just thought in this case, women you feature, they're buried under, layers of obscurity, right?
Mhm.
Like layer upon layer in a way. So I really love that you chose in some cases to highlight someone who might be considered a quote unquote groupie, or
Yeah,
someone who is really a background singer, but they were, in the way you presented them, so instrumental to the development of the music, right? And also, I found it just, if you could talk a bit about this whole bias against singers,
yeah,
like in rock and roll. It's like, it, in some ways, it said to me, now that explains why Nona Hendrix isn't a household name, right? So could you talk
right.
about that?
Yeah, this is something that feminist musicologists, especially feminist musicologists working in popular music, have really honed in on. One of my colleagues, Jacqueline Warwick, has written about this a lot in talking about girl groups and how there's such an irony that when people are writing music history, whether it's sort of academic, musicological texts, or just, mainstream writing about music in Rolling Stone magazine or Spin or, whatever, crawdaddy back in the day. There's this real emphasis on the instrumentalists,
Mhm.
and especially in rock, on the guitar and the type of guitar and what are the effects and distortion and how they play. And I love all that stuff because I love rock. But the singing really falls by the wayside. And for feminist scholars, the way people talk about it is the fact that, this sound issuing from the body is thought to be just natural, that there's no training or skill required to do it. Whereas with the guitar or piano or drums or any instrument, you have to practice and learn. And so it's a skill. And, obviously,
Obviously.
singing doesn't come naturally. You have to learn how to do it, and you have to practice and you train and you study and you experiment. But that really, goes away in a lot of discussions of rock. So because most of the women who have been involved in rock, African American or not African American, most of those women have been singers.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like a double, it's both women being marginalized and singers being marginalized. And I think the other thing is that many of the women that I talk about did not write their own music. So they weren't writing the songs that they were singing. And in rock, after the Beatles arrive in the mid 60s, after Bob Dylan is sort of, rising as this singer-songwriter, there becomes this emphasis on the sort of self-contained artist, that you write the music, you play the music, and you sing the music. And that is what a rock artist is. And so most of the Black women didn't fit into that standard. And so that leaves them out. But as you just mentioned, Nona Hendrix,
Yeah.
great songwriter in the group Labelle, and traveled into all different kinds of sounds, very, open-minded and wide-ranging in her musical experiments, but isn't treated as a sort of, great rock experimenter in the ways that some of the white men who were, doing similar things, and actually, in the case of someone like David Byrne collaborating with her, she's not received in the same way. So there's definitely a double standard with, that kind of puts singers in a more marginal space.
Well, this book is a corrective. That's what's
Right.
seriously. And I want to say this too, to make sure people are aware. I mean, this is also a great guide for discovering music. I mean, as you're reading it, as I'm reading it, I'm adding new songs to my playlist because it's introducing me to, it will introduce any reader to a wider range
Mm.
of songs that we should know about. So it's serving that purpose as well. It's really exciting in that way. And it makes me wonder, do you actually have a Spotify playlist for this book?
This is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is my homework that I haven't done. It'll happen soon. It's the challenge of doing everything in the pandemic,
Yeah.
but yeah. Yeah, and one of the I didn't realize that there were so many songs in the book when I started thinking about,
Oh,
well, what would I put, on a Spotify list? And there are a lot of songs.
that's a good,
So, hmm?
that's a good problem to
It
have.
is a good problem. It's a good problem. These women recorded a lot of music. They recorded a lot of music.
And I was sort of having another kind of fantasy. I'll ask you a slightly impossible question. I thought, what if someone came to you, Maureen, and said, all right, these biographies are amazing. We're going to do a biopic because these Black women's stories need to be told. Which one should, which one
I,
should you do? I mean, I personally, I was so obsessed with Devin Wilson's story. I didn't know what
yeah,
to do with myself, but
yeah.
yeah, like whose story should be told?
You know, I think all of their stories could be told. And I really hope that people like take that idea and run and like, let's do more research on these women. I have there's a soft spot in my heart for Big Mama Thornton.
Yeah.
Um, there's just something about her and just her, she was so open. It was just so raw that this song that she originated, you know, Hound Dog, just a little too early, you know, so she records that in 1953, and that's before Black people could be on television singing rhythm and blues. A few years later, LaVern Baker is able to go on TV and sing R&B. And then of course, Elvis Presley sings the song and he takes over the song, but she always said, you know, that's my song. Elvis the Pelvis took it from me and he messed it up, because the song really doesn't make sense when Elvis Presley sings it.
Right. What did you say when he sings it? It sounds like he's talking about a dog.
He is talking about a dog. He's talking about a literal hound dog.
Right.
And of course, Big Mama Thornton is not talking about
Yeah.
hound dogs. She's not talking about a beagle or a basset hound. So yeah, there's something about her story, but I also share a real interest in Devin Wilson. And actually the title of the book, Black Diamond Queens, comes from a Betty Davis song. And Betty Davis is this amazing, fascinating funk rock artist from the early 1970s who wrote songs for the Commodores that got them their record deal at Motown, wrote a song called Uptown to Harlem for the Chambers Brothers, but finally started cutting her own records in the 70s. And on her first album, she writes a song for her friend, Devin Wilson, and the song is called Steppin' in Her I. Miller Shoes. And at the point when Davis was writing this song, Devin had already died. And so she's sort of, it's like a lament. And in the course of the song, she talks about how Devin Wilson loved, you know, rock music spoke to her. And she was a Black Diamond Queen. And so I stole that line from Betty Davis because I think it's such a beautiful line and such a, you know, a frustrated and loving message to a friend who died too soon.
So we need that biopic too. We need
Right.
Davis, you know, we need Devin Wilson. We need them all, right?
Yeah, and there's room because there really aren't that many, you know, when we think, I mean, this is what I love about your book. And I think, you know, just going back to your comment about Saidiya Hartman, your book is another project about showing the possibilities that an African-American woman found in a time when Black women were so confined and so little was expected of them. And there are no possibilities for you.
Right.
And your mom found this way, you know, like the classic way out of no way. So I think it's like so many of us trying to do this kind of work to recover these stories. There are really not that many around. So the more the merrier, you know, the more we can tell these stories and circulate these stories, I think the better.
Definitely. I'm going to open it to Q&A in a moment. I'm just going to ask you one final question. I'm just curious, what surprised you the most in the process of your researching and writing this book?
I think I started talking about this book before I really knew what I was talking about. So I said, like, I want to do this book on Black women in rock, and I think Black women are really important to rock and roll history, but I didn't really have evidence for that. So I think as I went through, I was surprised that, oh, there really are a lot of examples. Like there really are, you know, there really is evidence. And I think the place where I saw it and it sort of surprised me the most, because maybe it's not the most intuitive, was with the Shirelles. The Shirelles, this girl group, 4 Black girls from Passaic, New Jersey, who were friends, who start singing together and they end up on the charts and becoming really popular in the early 1960s. So their music circulated in England. And when the British invasion happened and all of these British, rock bands come over, this was a time before that would have made sense. And so those bands were covering African-American music. And it turns out that the Shirelles were one of the groups that they covered the most. And so all of these rock bands that came over, whether it was Manfred Mann or the Yardbirds, were covering the Shirelles. But the most significant group that covered them were the Beatles. And so I wasn't really aware of how much the Beatles looked to the Shirelles for their vocal sound. So that, like the harmonies that they're doing, they're drawing on that idea, and their producer, George Martin, talked about them as a male Shirelles. And when they were playing in Hamburg in Germany, they were a cover band. The Beatles just played what was popular on the radio, and they would cover Shirelles songs. So when it came time to record their first album, they included some of those covers on the record. And you can hear the Shirelles' influence, not just in those songs, but in other places. And the Beatles themselves talked about how they were modeling their songwriting because, John Lennon and Paul McCartney learned to write songs by sort of copying or, following the lead of people who came before them, people like Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry, but they were also using the Shirelles songs as models. So I had no idea that, that was going to be the case. And so that to me was a big surprise.
That's huge, right? I'm so glad you got that in the book, and now it's on the record, right? Yeah. So I'm going to open it up to some questions. Let's see. Why do you think it's taken so many years for Betty Davis to be recognized? $1 million question.
Yeah, that one. I mean, I think the sort of standard response is she was too ahead of her time. But I think, as she says, when people say that to her, she said, I was testing the time. And I think she was actually very much in sync with her time in a lot of ways. So I think the sort of problem with Betty Davis is that she just doesn't fit what an African-American woman is supposed to do sonically. If you look at a picture of her, she looks, like a perfect evocation of 70s style, like early 70s style. She has the afro. She always had great clothes. She actually started out, she came to New York to go to FIT. So she wanted to go into fashion. So she always looks fantastic. But the sound, the things she did with her voice were not what people were wanting to hear from African-American women at that time. And it's taken a long time for African-American women to sort of be able to break out of this sort of limited range of vocal possibilities, mostly what people would call like a soulful sound, or it's a gospel-rooted sound. She didn't sound like that. She was much more connected to the blues. And at the time that she came, she was, releasing her music. The blues were really, receding in African-American popular music. The blues were what young white people were listening to. But, Betty Davis and also her friend Jimi Hendrix were sort of outliers by being interested in the blues. And so she just didn't fit very well. And then the other problem was the content of her lyrics. She's putting forward this very forthright, very self-possessed vision of what she wants, and specifically what she wants as a liberated young woman who doesn't feel like she has to settle down with one man. She wants to be a little bit more free. So those ideas, which were very much of the moment in the early 1970s, but there was still something around the respectability politics that she's breaching that made her problematic. So I think it just took a certain amount of time before those kinds of ideas, coupled with the experimental sound, were able to find a space. I mean, she had a kind of cult status. People who were into funk, which was a more experimental and yeah, I'd just say a more experimental African-American sound in the early 1970s that wasn't always played on Black radio. She fit in there, and so she had that fan base, but she just wasn't able to cross over to a bigger audience. So I just think it took time for her. But I think it's always hard to say, like, why didn't an artist succeed? There's so many different factors, and, you know, there's luck and chance also. But those would be my guesses.
Yeah. So Brian Adams is asking, did you come across any stories where women rockers were steered by the label to go into R&B and soul rather than do what they wanted? And because they refused to do that, they simply stopped recording and left the business altogether?
Well, there are definite stories of African-American artists being steered in certain directions musically, and it is toward R&B or whatever the Black music genre of the day is. So maybe it would be called soul or R&B. In the 80s, they were calling it Black music. But yes, so most of the artists would have been directed that way. And I mean, one of the things with Betty Davis is that she refused. She wasn't going to go in that direction, and she worked on an independent label. And I think that was another thing, that she wasn't on one of the major labels, so that maybe contributed to some of the limitations that she faced. But when I talk about Tina Turner, I talk about the fact that she was adamant that she did not want to be marketed as rhythm and blues, and she did not want to sing. She said, "I'm done with R&B. I've moved on." So she'd moved on from Ike and she'd moved on from R&B, and she said, "I want to be rock." And she said that because she understood that rock was the market where the money was. That was the big audience. So, but she had to, basically she was fighting. I mean, at that point, she didn't have a contract. So she was trying to get a contract in an environment where the assumption was, well, especially because you're Tina Turner, of course you're gonna do R&B, and she's saying, "No, I want to do rock." And it took a while for them to get the deal that she wanted and that she was comfortable with. And along the way, she did record some old, Motown songs and some old soul classics, and she was just like, "This isn't what I really want to be doing."
A little disco to get
a
her.
little bit disco. And these were successful songs. And so that made the record company think, well, maybe we can do something with this. Okay. But I think the thing with Tina Turner, and that, Brian was asking, about being pushed into R&B, that's a very American move. And I think what's significant about her comeback is that she's working with a non-American team. So her manager was a white Australian, and he took her to London, and they worked with a group of British musicians. Most of them were hardcore Tina Turner fans. They had grown up listening to her music, and they were like, "Whatever you want us to do, Miss Turner, we will do." But they got out of the boxes that we have in the United States for African-American music.
Right.
And by being in England and working with the British team, I think she had more, she had more space to do something different. And of course it was, Private Dancer was a huge success.
Yeah. So let's see. I think that some people have asked their questions in the chat.
Oh.
So Rob Fields would like to know, given your research, when you look at the musical landscape today, how do you contextualize artists like Santa Gold and Janelle Monáe, Her, etc.?
Well, I don't know if Rob's asking about genre, but I think one of the things that's interesting now, and you mentioned Spotify playlists, I think one of the things that's interesting now in the musical landscape is that, I don't want to say that genre doesn't matter, because I think it still matters, but I think there's more space and there's more mobility, and we're not quite as locked into it, so that the artists can move back and forth across boundaries, even on a single album. and that people, that's not confusing to listeners. So I think we're in a moment where where artists can experiment. And the people you mentioned, and there are others, there's a kind of critical mass of African-American women who are going beyond the boundaries of sort of like what formally gets defined as Black music, or whatever, you know, or R&B, you know, like whatever that is supposed to be. And they don't really seem to feel like they have to explain a lot about, you know, what they're doing. People may try to explain them. So that example that I read with Santi White at the beginning, people may try to compartmentalize them in a way, but that's critics. I don't know if audiences are really tracking on that so much. I think people, it's kind of like the thing that musicians always say, we just want people who like good music. And so if you're putting music out that people are interested in and listening to, the audience doesn't really care whether it gets categorized as rock or Southern rock or R&B or dance music. They just want the music. And we're getting a lot of interesting stuff as a result.
So Brian Tate wants to know, how do the experiences of these women compare to the Black women artists who preceded them?
So the women who preceded them, and this I know way less about, but I think, I mean, I'm not sure if he has specific figures in mind, but if I think about the blues women from the 1920s, for example, like Bessie Smith and Alberta Hunter, or jazz artists in the 30s and 40s, like Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald. I mean, I think there's always a struggle with being in a situation where you're not always working with people who have your best interest at heart. And so all of these women deal with certain levels of exploitation with their managers or with the record labels. They signed away things, signed away rights or money that they should have held on to, but no one was telling them, you know, you need to hold on to this. So I think there's some of that. I think in most cases there were, there was always cross-racial collaborations happening. I think what's different with the women in the rock and roll era is that some of the segregation is starting to break down. So you see a little bit of that in the 1950s, but then it really starts to look different in the 1960s and 1970s. And so I think there are more collaborations. I'd hesitate to say that they were on equal footing with the people that they're collaborating with, but maybe more equal footing than it would have been 20 years before. But I do see a lot of continuities in also with thinking about the blues women, with some of the things that the women are expressing in the music. Right. And that, you know, Betty Davis, her connection to blues was a sonic connection, but also, you know, the lyrics, the kinds of things those blues women were singing about, Betty Davis also chose to sing about. And Labelle also, they're, you know, very forthright in talking about sexuality. So I think, I mean, those are some examples of connections.
So Julia Chance she says Joy out of Atlanta had a brief moment during the mid-90s. Yeah, and seemed to be really influenced by Betty Davis. Do you have an opinion about why she did not become more popular?
I think I feel like I have to answer the same way that I answered the question about Betty Davis, that it's so hard to know. There's such a confluence of factors. And, you know, Joy's sound is so interesting because it's one of those, I think maybe one of the challenges is people who are marketing the music want to be able to put a label on a sound, and her sound may not be really easy to label. So that might be one thing. And it also might just have been the moment that people were listening for other kinds of sounds when she was coming forward. I mean, certainly there are people who heard her and they really loved Joy. And so she, you know, she has a following, but the music just wasn't able to get out. You know, there's an issue. I mean, back then it would be a question of airplay, like what radio station would play this music. And I think with many African-American women who are doing more experimental stuff, there's this problem of falling through the cracks where, well, you're a little bit too hard or rock for a Black radio station, but there's something that's too Black or something else for a rock station. And so there's not a sort of easy, comfortable place to slot these artists into. And I think that's another part of the challenge.
Mhm. You know, I wanted to say too that I was thinking about that whole Toni Morrison paraphrase that, you know, you write the book you want to read. And I was thinking about you, the teenage you. If you make reference to that at one
Mm-hmm.
in your book, that if you had had this book when you were young, it would have made such a difference. So what do you say to a young Black woman out there, or a Black teenage girl who feels a little bit like a unicorn in her community or her group,
Yeah.
what she can find in, you know, between the pages of this book?
I think I would say that I hope she would find possibilities, and that I think that it's so important to, you know, stay true to the thing that you want to do, even when everyone's telling you this doesn't make sense, or we don't understand it, or it doesn't fit. And that may sound sort of like a sappy thing, but I do think that that's what so many of these women did. And then some of them just reached a point and said, well, I'm going to do something else. But that reader is really someone who I had in mind as I was writing the book. You know, maybe sort of conjure like, who might read this book? Who would I hope would read this book? And I really was thinking about people who maybe aren't familiar with the history of rock and roll, people who are not hardcore rock and roll fans, although I hope that, you know, that would also be an audience. But I was also thinking about younger readers who maybe know a little bit of the history and are kind of curious. And I would hope that they would, you know, be able to take away like, just like their possibilities. Like there are so many different ways to be an African-American woman. And I think that's one thing that really comes through in the book. Like these women are not the same. You know, if you go from Big Mama Thornton to the Shirelles, to LaVern Baker, to Tina Turner, to Betty Davis, they're not all the same. They have this common category, African-American woman, but there's such difference. And that's something that in my research that I really just want to celebrate. And I think we're so conditioned to just like a very narrow set of boxes. And so I would want this maybe to be like a tool for helping to break out of those boxes and, you know, follow what is right for you.
Well, that's beautiful. Black Diamond Queens is such an important book, Maureen. It's so,
Thank you.
and it really is such an important addition to the canon. It does exactly what you had hoped. It's really, I feel like it's a book about possibility and expanding our ideas of what Black women are. We've always known what they are, but
Right.
here's more validation, right? So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That means a lot coming from you.
Oh, this was fun. I could keep talking, but I think they want us to
We have to wrap up.
this up in a certain kind of way. So
That was just such a beautiful place to end. I was like that what a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much, Bridgett and Maureen, for being here. I'm making notes for my playlist. I can't wait to read the whole book. And I wanted to mention, if anybody missed any part of tonight's event or you want to watch it again, we're going to be posting the recording to Greenlight Bookstore's YouTube channel. So look out for it there. And don't forget to get your copy of Black Diamond Queens in the store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. So thanks, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.